greatest good for the greatest number over the longest time. Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, the way that they kind of saw the world from a utilitarian standpoint. Conservation is wise use. I really don't like preservation. I think people have a role in the ecosystem, and um, especially indigenous stewardship.
Welcome to Shaping the Basin. I'm here today with Ken Sandusky. Ken is the Homelands Director for Modoc Nation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
This is fun. I often ask, who should I have on the show? And you did a tour one time with Scott White. And I had guests that were on that tour come back to me and say, you need to get Ken on. And then I shared an episode on LinkedIn and said, who else should I ask? And I started getting all these comments. So thank you for jumping in when I emailed. The other thing that we do is we ask our audience if they have any questions. And I did get one question for you. So we'll get started with those. Then I'll ask my questions.
Okay.
So I was told to ask you about the microclimate on the Lower Klamath Lake.
Right into it.
So talk to us a little bit about that.
Okay. If you think about the influence of large water bodies on the surrounding landscape, it seems pretty self-evident to me that the evaporative loss that we call it now in those water bodies would have a critical influence on the surrounding landscape. And so with the prevailing winds from the west, from the northwest, mostly in the Klamath Basin, then all those landscapes out east of Upper Klamath, Lower Klamath, Tule Lake, Clear Lake would have come to rely, over time on that influence. And that goes for the water bodies out there, the smaller water bodies, the tributaries, the creeks and stuff like that, but also the species mix and just the general vegetative condition, which then would result in additional wildlife resources and values out there. And we see in the Shoppish planning area south of Modoc Ranch, which is southeast of Lower Klamath Lake, a lot of dry lake beds. And I think a lot of folks just kind of assume that those are ephemeral lakes, seasonal in nature. But I see, and have since I was a kid, a lot of evidence that these were year-round lakes in the past. And so, I think that there's a reason why people told you to ask me that question. It's because it's something that I've really been pushing, and that the Modoc Nation supports, is that concept get taken into account with some of the water management decisions. It's not to take away from any of the other needs. Obviously, there's great reasoning for why they make the decisions they make, but the models and the equations that inform those decisions end at evapotranspiration. It's a loss. And best available science, which you hear a lot of around here, right, is 30 to 70% of that evaporative loss, I'm putting up air quotes, is recaptured in the watershed. And so if we're making decisions about not providing water to large landscapes without taking into account where that evaporative water would have come back into the system, then we're making decisions without regard to those unintended consequences. And it's our contention, hopefully we'll get into that. I grew up right here overlooking Lower Klamath Lake. We're actually on the road I grew up on. And from here, when there's water in Lower Klamath Lake, you can see what I'm talking about. Those cumulus clouds build with the heat, and at a certain time in the afternoon, they break off. And from my experience, anecdotally, I see them always going towards the northeast, which would mean that a lot of that water is probably recaptured into the watershed, fed back in from the top all the way down, Gerhardt Mountain, Sycan Sprague River area. So again, not at none of our contentions are meant to be at the expense of other needs and uses, but it is trying to challenge folks to think through some of what I consider to be lacking in the decision making process. Um, and so that comes into another whole line of reasoning, and it's around regenerative agricultural practices and this kind of burgeoning thought process and some really solid evidence pointing towards vegetation management as having an impact on the overall amount of precipitation that a piece of land gets. And so I should have came more prepared, but you can find this on the Understanding Ag website. And so this is a really great grazing based regenerative agriculture mindset that these folks go around and teach. And I've been a student of, but one of their case studies is in the, I believe, Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. And on one side of the fence, they graze it with regenerative grazing practices. It's high intensity, low duration versus low intensity, high duration, where you just turn the cows out and leave them. It's a little more work. You got to rotate them regularly and use electric fence and move the fence all the time. Basically, the cows are on any one piece of land for no more than a couple few days a year, really 3 bites a year on each blade of grass. And the other side is grazed in the more traditional, just turn them out and let them manage themselves framework. And almost every time precipitation comes over, it hits a fence and starts dropping rain on the side that's well vegetated versus the side that's lacking that ground cover, which is evidence of interaction between earth and sky. And so we are in a very zero sum mindset in the way that we're dealing with issues in the Klamath Basin. And these are these things that I'm bringing up are evidences of small aspects of probably what are much larger aspects of our land management practices actually having a detrimental impact on the overall amount of precipitation that falls in the basin, not just from the local small water cycle, where if it's evaporated here, some of it comes back down here, but in a larger influence over precipitative events in the basin, where at times, if we, under the current management paradigm, we could have clouds going over that don't drop precip, that if we manage things a little bit differently, or at least take that into our decision making process, might increase the overall amount of precipitation we get. There's some evidence coming out of the Great Salt Lake right now to this, effect. And I mean, it's just, again, to me, it's pretty obvious that there's been a marked shift, and there's plenty of blame to go around. It's, we drained those lakes for agriculture a long time ago, so there would have been a big hit back then. We've gotten really good at pushing water away, but not so good at like saving it up here. And so there's all that kind of stuff too. But there's also this notion that when we sacrifice a landscape for the health of another landscape, that we don't necessarily know what the rippling implications of that are within the ecologic cycles.
I think the exciting thing that I'm hearing in this is it has always seemed to me a little bit like historically a decision has been made without taking into account the entire ecosystem, like
Mm-hmm.
how it affects all the other parts of it. Like
Mm-hmm.
this is going to affect this without looking at what does it do. And so this is interesting because it actually seems like it takes into account more of that holistic ecosystem, if you will. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least, I guess, from what I'm trying to say is, take that into account. It to me, and maybe this gets me in trouble, but you learn about this kind of stuff in grade school, right? The water cycle, the small and large water cycle. It's like 8th grade earth science. That's where I learned it at Ponderosa Junior High, and I remember the teacher, was his name, Mr. Clark, I think. And he was a great teacher. He had us draw it. And, it's something that really stuck with me. It's probably part of who I am, intrinsically. But it definitely is something that I've walked with since then, and it seems a little bit short-sighted and even egregious to me that we're making these hugely impactful decisions without taking into account these really fundamental processes.
That's how I feel. And you mentioned being at Ponderosa. I think I told someone a few years ago when I was talking about the. It doesn't feel like we're always looking at the whole ecosystem.
Hmm.
I even mentioned it. I remember in fifth grade learning about everything that makes up an ecosystem. And it's
Hmm.
not just one little part, everything affects something else. So
Hmm.
that's exciting to hear your. Thank you for sharing
One
about the.
one of the quotes I
Yeah.
use for this all the time is, I can't even remember who, but and the first rule to intelligent tinkering is saving all the parts and pieces. So you go tinkering with a machine and you don't have all the parts, it's never going to run again.
That's a good.
Yeah.
That's a good analogy.
Mhm.
Well, let's talk for a few minutes. Thank you for sharing
Yeah, I
that.
would jumped right into
But
it.
I know
I
I
thought
was
that would
like, I
come
don't know
later.
if I'm going to ask this first question first, but I try to ask those and
Mhm.
let people know I'm going to ask their questions. But talk to us about Modoc Nation. That's what
Sure.
you're currently doing. What is Modoc Nation?
Okay, well, the membership of the Modoc Nation are the descendants of the Modoc people who were removed from the Klamath Basin after the Modoc War 152 years ago, um, to Indian Territory. So after the war ended at the lava beds, the Modoc people were forced to watch their leaders hung, and they were loaded. These Modocs, there were Modocs that stayed behind, were loaded onto a cattle car in winter and shipped like animals across the country, some shackled to the floor of the train car. No clothes, no really nothing, even babies with no shoes on their feet, kind of thing. And um, they got there to Baxter Springs in Kansas, just over the border, and were allotted some land on the Quapaw Agency in the very northeastern corner of Oklahoma, and really swiftly set about building their own winter quarters and just trying to make a life in Oklahoma. Um, a lot didn't make it. Captain Jack's daughter, baby Ruth there, she didn't make it. Rose, I'm sorry, she didn't make it, and many others, but enough did, and they got established, and some tried to come back. Some, they were allowed to come back a couple of times. Some were able to make it back and stay. Some tried to come back and weren't welcome and had to go back to Oklahoma. Some just knew there was nothing to come home to, and so they have survived that and then come to prosper in modern times. They're very economically successful tribe, small in number, but it's kind of multi-million-dollar businesses, construction. They have one casino, but just a very diverse array of business interests, and they have a good economic outlook on the future, and very much interested in setting up future generations for success. Very focused on education, working, job opportunities, and one of those kind of focuses is reconnecting with the homeland, providing opportunities for those Modoc descendants to at least have the opportunity to contribute to the stewardship of the lands their ancestors stewarded since time immemorial, but also potentially even to come visit, be involved, and maybe even someday have the opportunity to again live here.
Mhm.
That's not anything that's in the short term planning. It's all about contributing to ecologic and economic success. Chief Berkey Bile says, "Float all boats." That's one of the general marching orders we get, and so what we're trying to do is synergize um, to be additive without taking away from elsewhere.
Mhm.
We hope that we're doing a pretty good job of that. Obviously, it's not always really easy to you know, n- not at least be seen as like taking away from a zero sum mentality. But we don't have that. We feel like if we're working together and we all kind of have each other's interests at heart, that zero sum, like if you get something that somehow comes out of my skin, that doesn't really apply as long as all the partners have each other's best interests in mind.
Mhm. And you're the Homelands director.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct. So what do you do as the homelands
Yeah.
director?
I mean, basically, what I just said about helping to reconnect, they had purchased a number of properties and they needed those to be managed. There's been a lot of challenges, and somebody needed to be here to watch over the lands that they were investing in. But to a larger degree, just to provide an educated presence and help to build those bridges, kind of assert their rights for like government to government consultation and involvement in different projects and efforts in the homelands. And I mean, it's really, like I said before, their effort to contribute to be the stewards that their ancestors were. And with the dispossession that occurred during the genocide and ecocide and their forced removal, they need employees, supporters who are connected to help them rebuild those connections. I grew up here, I have roots on both sides of the fence, and um, very much, tied to the Lower Klamath Lake landscape. And that's where they bought the property. And, at the time I worked for the Forest Service and I was doing public affairs and I was the tribal liaison. And so had that kind of other side of the table experience with government to government consultation and grant writing, project management, storytelling. This very generalist. My dad's a mechanic. My grandpa was a logger and a farmer. And so, we have a very eclectic kind of like skill set in my family. And I added like writing and, websites and social media and stuff through my public affairs time. And so, it's a good fit for me too, because I'm so general, mile wide, inch deep, I always say. So I can kind of understand at least partially almost anything that's going on, and have a meeting like this in the morning and be out on the ranch like maintaining farm equipment in the afternoon. It's probably not a lot of folks with that kind of skill set that are willing to quit a nice cushy federal government job to come to work for the tribe.
But I think when I read your bio, you talked about the deep connection you feel to
Yeah.
the area,
Yeah.
and that probably fuels that work and
Sure.
allowed you to feel comfortable leaving the Forest
Yeah.
Service or whatever you were doing before. Talk to me about the connection you feel with the land.
Yeah, with the land and the people, really, because, I went to Riverside right up on the hill here. And the way I understand it, Riverside was over 100 years old, or right at 100 years old at that time. Can't remember for sure, but it was the oldest functioning school in Oregon. And the library in there was at least partially from the Klamath County High School, which was even older than that when it got torn down. And so I had access to a really old library and just a really supportive staff. The educators at Riverside were, I mean, it's not what they talk about these days. We had really cool teachers, and they encouraged us to follow our own interests. And I read every Klamath Echoes. I pulled every book I could about the Modoc people, and some of those were at least, you know, shortly after contemporary written articles, or books in different publications. And at the same time, I was learning about my heritage. My grandma, Pat Pound Bailey, she was a bartender at the Blue Ox. People might remember her. She was also the mother of Kenny Pound, who I know a lot of people will remember. I'm named for him, my mom's older brother. He was a very active athlete, and they were very successful in their time with state championships and Babe Ruth World Series and stuff like that. But uh, she was Okoma Choctaw, and it wasn't something she was raised to talk a lot about, but I was proud of it. Even when I was little, it was something that was important to me, and I was exploring that myself. It wasn't a connection to the culture. We got to go to the powwows around here and stuff, but not participate, just watch. And obviously, that wasn't the same culture that the Choctaws have. So I was doing a lot of reading even back then about that and trying to learn about that heritage and the other heritages too. I can share about those. I have a very famous Polish grandfather who was an explorer way back when, pioneer, the most famous Polish pioneer, Antoni Sadowski. But anyway, grandma was taught to just pass. And that's what she kind of expected of us. And I was a little different. I wanted people to know I was proud of it. And think times were changing. Then it wasn't as dangerous to be native at that time than it was when she was a kid, especially in Oklahoma. And so while I was learning about my heritage, it was just natural for me to, learn about the Modoc stuff too. And Captain Jack was always a hero for a lot of us. I'm not the only one. We always saw that. I mean, I think the story was told in a way that didn't just vilify. Like, I mean, they did their best, some people, but there was enough because it was the first like actively reported Indian war. There was enough real time facts that the what led up to the war got recorded, and I mean, we know who were the victims and who were the villains in that. So, and to me, it was obvious back then. And so I naturally saw a connection there for myself. I live here, right where the Modocs lived, and they're over there in Oklahoma, and I have roots there too. And for two forcibly removed tribes, kind of that parallel story of survival. I think I didn't necessarily have those words for it back then. I just knew I liked Captain Jack and that his people were in Oklahoma, and had a lot of friends and family who were Modocs and other Klamath tribes members here. I don't know if that answers your question or
Yeah,
not,
no, I
but yeah,
think that's
Riverside School had a lot to do with it. That it was historic in nature. And I mean, we climbed the hill every day, and we had a lot of freedom. We spent a lot of time on the river back then. I spent a whole lot of time on the Link River when I was a kid.
that's
Mm.
that's interesting. I grew up in Colorado, in Ignacio, Colorado,
Mm.
which is home of the Skayute Indians. It was there, and that history there was always interesting to me.
Mhm.
And I think it's interesting when you come here that there's so much history. But um, where where would people go to learn more if they came here? That's the
Mhm.
struggle I've always had. Where would you go to learn about the tribal
Yeah.
history in Klamath and get good info?
Yeah. Well, the Klamath County Museum's a good place to start. The Fables right here. I mean, there's a pretty mm, checkered history with some of that stuff, but I mean, the items are interesting. The books, like Jeff Riddle, Wynema's son, wrote a book. It's the only book written by a Modoc who was present at the time. And then Debbie Riddle was kind of our elder, our mentor in a lot of this, and she just has an immense amount of information. And all those books, I mean, they have a lot of information to varying degrees of validity or perspective. There's one book that is for sale in Merrill at the hardware store. I think you can get it at other places too, like maybe at the Klamath County Museum. But it's just a compilation of all the news stories of the time. That was very interesting. I mean, if you want to learn about the Modoc War, there's a plethora of resources. If you want to learn the real true story outside of that, then you got to do quite a bit of digging. But there's programs and I mean, plenty of info on the web. And I mean, we got the Klamath Tribes right here. They have their own resources available. There's a Klamath Tribes dictionary on the Klamath and Modoc language dictionary on the web, and you can just look any kind of translations up there, even place names and things like that.
If a picture says 1,000 words, imagine the story. 24 frames a second. Can tell about your business. 40 Deuce Films.
I know we talked about the work that you do as the Homeland Director in general terms, but can you talk to us about a couple of the specific projects maybe you're working on?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so Shawbush is the name, and I apologize to folks who may think I may know that I'm mispronouncing, but that's where I've landed with advice from Modoc descendants. The name of a village site meant sun, I believe, and it's right there where the ranch is, and so we use that name for the co-stewardship project. And so the Modoc National Forest has the Mount Dome Management Area. And when I worked for the Forest Service, we called it the peninsula because on the map of the forest, it's just this little arm that sticks out by itself. I called it the Forgotten Area because I grew up there, but all the way down in Alturas, people don't even really think of it as part of the forest. Like some people really didn't even know that that was part of the forest. And so it's also not timber, it's juniper sage steppe. So just not the kind of area that gets a lot of attention from the Forest Service for obvious reason. But it needs attention, just like any sage steppe ecosystem. It's in peril from juniper encroachment, cheatgrass, changing the fuels regime, and creating more intense wildfire. And we're losing sage steppe biome at a pretty quick rate to these, external factors encroaching weeds and juniper. And so we got a co-stewardship agreement with the Forest Service to do our own NEPA on that landscape, National Environmental Policy Act planning to clear the restoration work that it needs. Basically, just thin out the juniper, remove a lot of the encroaching juniper that would have been kept in check by cultural burning and natural ignitions pre-fire exclusion. I mean, a lot of our problems are because we don't like fire. The more good fire means less bad fire, and natives knew that back in the day. They, traditional ecological knowledge is very much largely based around the smart use of fire. But our effort is really to complete the NEPA so we can get out there and do the work that needs to be done on the landscape and make it able to withstand fire, to enhance the good fire, and maybe create opportunities to avoid the catastrophic wildfire, to reduce the negative impacts of encroaching juniper. They transpire a lot of water out of the ground. They exacerbate erosion problems. That word is allelopathy. So they secrete a chemical into the soil that suppresses other plant growth. Just a whole lot of things that, juniper is native to this region and actually a sacred plant to the indigenous people, very useful for bows and medicine and other uses, but they were on a very much lower presence on the landscape. They've proliferated to the degree that they've taken over a lot of areas, and the ecologic function is basically gone. And so we just want to do that work. A lot of that effort by the Forest Service and NRCS and private landowners has been focused out by Clear Lake. And that's where the sage grouse still are. The last sage grouse really in California, last lek in California where they dance for their mates. But this area over here is part of the sage grouse habitat. There's just not birds there right now, so it never got any attention. But it's right behind the ranch, and we're already doing that work there. And so to get up there and do that work out there, we have ORCAL, Resource Conservation and Development Council, hosting the interdisciplinary team that is conducting the NEPA analysis. That I need to give a shout out to Modoc County, because this retired workers concept is something that was built on the Modoc National Forest in partnership with Modoc County to complete the Devil's Garden Wild Horse Territory Management Plan, which I came in towards the end of that planning process and then implemented their plan. My job was to promote the horses for adoption. So we built the wild horse program based on what the retired workers program did. So nowadays, that same program has been adapted to allow for the hiring of local developmental candidates for critical roles in the Forest Service, like recreation, cleaning the facilities, like keeping campgrounds open and stuff like that. And the Modoc is innovative in that way, where other units in, current times are strapped with keeping bathrooms clean and safe accommodations for recreationists. The Modoc is ahead of the curve because they had this agreement in place with the county farm bureau and the UC cooperative extension. So I just cloned that. I was involved with it. I liked the way it was. I went and told the people running, I'm stealing this, and they said go ahead. And we put that together, for Shoppish, and built an interdisciplinary team to do our own NEPA. And we ended up with two really high power retirees from the Forest Service. Patty Grantham was a forest supervisor on the Klamath and had larger roles too. And then district ranger, a retired district ranger from Mount Shasta or McLeod, Mike Hupp, doing the kind of leading the NEPA and the relationship with the Forest Service to get that document complete. It's been a challenge. We have a America the Beautiful grant to fund that. It's through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And we got a duplicate award from the Bureau of Reclamation. That money's kind of hung up in limbo right now, but we didn't lose the NIFWIF money, so we're continuing with that in hopes that we can get that other money to complete, there needs to be a lot of archaeological surveys and things like that in order to clear those treatment actions. That's Shoppish. So we also have been awarded California Tribal Nature-Based Solutions grant to purchase an old hunt club down there, an old duck hunting club on Lower Klamath Lake. And that is kind of much more in the early stages. We just got our first bill in for that for reimbursement. The tribe had made just tens of thousands of dollars in investments, laid out that money that we're now seeking to recoup now that we're at that stage with the grant award. And we will conduct a integrated resource management planning process as a result of that grant too, for that property and the other Modoc Nation holdings in the homelands. Will include certain properties to a little lesser degree for their complexity and things like that, but it'll largely be focused on the natural resource management, and give the two homelands employees a shout out to Brian Herbert. He's the other, Modoc Nation representative in the area. And, once we complete that planning process, we'll have a document that really guides what we do day in and day out.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, a lot of the Modoc people are in Oklahoma. Is that correct?
No.
Is that where, I mean, you mentioned the casino and some of the economic stuff that they're doing, but that's in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, when the war was building up, not all the Modocs went to fight. So Chief Sconchin's people stayed at Yainix, is the way I understand it. And I'm going to apologize, if I get this wrong. I'm not trying to appropriate culture. And so you should have, I have some suggestions about people who can.
I can do that. I was just trying to make sure in my head that I
do want to answer your question though, because a lot of Modocs didn't get removed. They got moved up to the Klamath Tribes Reservation, which is now Klamoya, right? Mm-hmm. Klamath, Modoc, Yahoo, Skimbana, Snake, Paiute. So they became one tribe out of three. So there's the majority of them, the Modoc people, are still here and never left. It's a small subset, and especially considering how few people survived over there after the forced removal, that we're only talking about 350 members there. I think there's quite a few more Modoc people in the Klamath tribes.
Okay. In terms of geography, what made up the homelands? Where is that area?
Yeah, so just on the border here. So, I mean, the treaty describes the southern boundary as from Goose Lake to Medicine Lake, and some accounts I also see where it used Mount Shasta as the peak to peak. So the Klamath tribes peoples talk about peak to peak. And I'm not, again, you have to talk to them about that, but in the descriptions in the treaties and other ethnographies, that's how they laid that out. And so there were Modoc people right here on the Link River. It was kind of a shared territory, but there are histories about Modocs who lived right on the Link River, um, you know, even after Linkville was founded, George Nurse time. And so, um, really out to, Lakeview and up to the Cascade Crest, and kind of maybe, you know, depending on who you talk to, kind of Sprague River area. Yinix was the agency that was specific for them. And a lot of the stuff is general. Like like I said, mile wide, inch deep. So I'm going to say, take it with a grain of salt and go talk to a more expert. Remind me before we quit, because there's definitely a couple of people who could expound a lot better than me on that. I am not a Modoc or Klamath. I
Okay.
just am,
You're just interested in the history and you feel a
yeah,
connection.
yeah.
What do you hope for in the work that you're doing? What do you hope, let's say 10 or 15 years from now, what do you hope has happened?
Well, I don't have a lot of expectations for that. Eh, the greatest good for the greatest number over the longest time. Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt, the way that they kind of saw the world from a utilitarian standpoint. Conservation is wise use. I really don't like preservation. I think people have a role in the ecosystem, and um, especially indigenous stewardship. I don't think that we're restoring nature if the ultimate goal is to exclude people. I think that, this landscape was intensively managed since time immemorial. So I guess that's what I'd like to see, if there's just one thing, is like to restore the Modoc people and their allies and families' ability to interact with the landscape and to steward that stuff. And personally, in 10 or 15 years, I'd like to be free to do what I want to do. Go like just take my goats around and reduce fuels or whatever. Ride my motorcycle and go fishing. But I would hope that 15 years from now that we're talking about ecological processes. We're including and when we talk about evapotranspiration, we're wondering where that water might come back down. And really, this is the kind of stuff that gets me in trouble, but the Modoc homelands have been sacrificed from an ecological perspective. And like I said before, there's plenty of blame to go around. I do not care about the blame. I care about making it better incrementally without wiping people out, without taking away livelihoods and, that kind of thing. So, I'd like to see those lakes functioning again. I'd like to see a balance between agriculture and nature that I think is possible. It's why this area was so attractive for agriculture, and it's something we lost along the way. And I think it's coming back around. I'm seeing a lot of exciting kind of signs from the agricultural community that and projects that are trying to restore that balance to a degree, and I guess that's what I would hope for. I've said it many times. So, with Mr. White and the work that KDD is doing to reconnect the Lower Klamath Lake floodplain, it's like, I'm a fish guy. Like, if there's one thing I want to do, it's to be out fishing. And, what I know from that experience is that habitat connectivity is crucial for healthy fisheries. And you just don't know the way the fish are using the habitat if it's all connected. Like, we have fish in the lake that run downriver to spawn and vice versa. And it's just a very dynamic system, but a lot of it has been cut off. And so I'd like to see those habitats in the Modoc homeland again connected to the whole thing. And a really short-term goal of mine right now is to be able to, within reason and without taking away from other people's efforts, take advantage of floodwaters. Right now, all winter, we've been watching thousands of CFS get diverted from Lost River Diversion Canal to the Klamath River. it's uncontested water. The downriver tribes have, they need those flushing flows, but they have said that if we had the capacity to divert that water, people would be on board with that. So we can only put 500 cubic feet per second ish into Lower Klamath Lake. Let me amend that. It's less than 1,000 total. So if the D pump, which is how they move water from Tule Lake to Lower Klamath Lake, is functioning well, and there's not subsidence issues, and the power bill hasn't gotten to them yet and all that, you're looking at right at less than 500 there. Running the 80 canals about 500. So we're really at no more than 1,000 cubic feet per second that we have the infrastructural capacity to retain. That's all water that would have been retained in the basin at Tule Lake. We can't do that anymore there without flooding people out, but at Lower Klamath Lake we can. It looks good from the highway, but it's still dry to a large degree. There's a lot of capacity left. If we had the ability to get that water straight from the diversion canal into the lake, that would go a long way towards flattening out the drought curve, from that microclimate perspective. So I would like to see some infrastructural investments that allow us to eliminate delivery capacity as a limiting factor to getting water in Lower Klamath Lake.
Interesting. What is something you wish, thinking about all the work that you do and the connection that you feel, what's something you wish the average person in Klamath knew?
you know, I- when I'm sorry, I think that the state that the Klamath Basin was created in was perfect. It's just amazing. From we're looking back over it through the lens of time, and very much filtered, idealized, whatever. But the Klamath Basin didn't really know drought. It didn't know flood. The system was such that it could absorb those outlying climatic conditions without having much of an effect at all on the river and the lakes. They would just expand during times of flood and contract. There were numerous choke points where a quote metered flow could occur, and anything beyond that would just be backed up into the immense floodplains. The groundwater connections, the connection with the Sacramento drainage as well through the lava tubes down at Tule Lake. And we know that from the Medicine Lake aquifer that comes out Jumaui Springs on the Pitt River or on Fall River, then dumps into the pit. And so the hydrologic connectivity and the way the geology and the volcanology all work together was like to me, it's just evidence of creation, right? It was just too perfect to be an accident. And that's what I wish people knew. Like, this place was so amazingly water resilient, and food grew everywhere. Everything was food back then. And just like, sometimes I just wish I had could go back and live in those times. I probably wouldn't be welcome, but I would love to. Imagine the fishing back then.
Oh, gosh.
So that's what I kind of wish people would think more about, is like we still have so much value, so much beauty, and natural resource, but that's just a small fraction of what it was like back then. I think we have the ability to get a lot of that back. Dr. Winter, I've known him since I was a little kid. First time I broke my arm real bad, he helped set it and stuff. And he says, make it rhyme. Like, we're never going to bring back what was here before, but the best thing we can do is take what we have now and introduce some of what was here by creation, and then kind of make it run, make it work together. And I always try to quote Dr. Winter on that, because he has a way of just boiling it down. I put way too many words to it.
I like that. Thank you for your time
Mhm.
today. I have 3 questions, just fun questions at the
Okay.
end that I ask. So tell me about one of your role models.
Hmm. There's a lot there. I mentioned Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt. I think that utilitarian ethic is how I walk this earth. It's like, just a part of who I am. Everything I do is very utilitarian. I kind of look for the value and synergies, multiple levels of value, and kind of use that to look down the railroad tracks for derailers and try to avoid those. Sometimes people think I'm a little negative, but I'm like, I've spent a lot of time trying to warn people about what might get us in trouble down the road. Captain Jack was an amazing leader. He just followed the will of the people. And, even at times when he knew that it would cost him everything, he still did what the people wanted of him. And, there's a lot of folks in the basin that I look at as mentors now too. Is plenty of tribal folks who are engaged and caring and, just want to see a better future for everybody. And a lot of people like that in the ag community too. And really anybody who's like coming to the table with a clean heart and looking towards the future and not just thinking about their own bottom line all the time. Those are my heroes.
Would make sense. If I gave you a billboard and you could put anything on it in the county, what would it say?
I would love to see a representation of the hydrologic function in the basin. And I mean, what would it say? It was like, it was perfect. I don't know.
No,
That's
I
probably
like
a little
it.
pie in the sky.
No,
I do.
it's
I have a tattoo on my arm that says "for the greatest good,"
uh-huh.
right? And I think that's really how I try to live my life. Like, it's like, think about how we affect everything around us, and if we all just kind of think about floating all boats,
Yes.
I think we'd be in a lot better place.
I love that. And then the last question, if I handed you $250,000 and you could do anything, but you had to make a difference, what would you do with it?
I really need to hire some ranch hands right now. One of the grants that we've been awarded but has been hung up is for our regenerative grazing crew. And I'm actually have that almost that exact amount, and it's unrestricted funding. And I've been thinking about recommending to the council that we use some of that to hire those. We need some labor, and Brian and I are both kind of middle-aged, and we didn't exactly like take great care of ourselves when we were young, so we need people that we can say, we need this, we move that and clean up that, and we can make a lot more progress like that. We didn't talk about the goats. I have a regenerative goat herd that I've been building for over a decade, and that it requires, like I said, with the regenerative grazing, they need to be moved a lot. And when you're in meetings and podcasts every day, you can't spend all that time on the land. So we need people out there to kind of do that heavy lifting.
So tell me a little bit. I don't want to run out of time, but tell me a little bit about your goat herd, because the second time you mentioned it. So tell me about the goats.
Yeah,
no, I'm glad. Tell me about the goats.
I started my goat herd with the idea that it was going to be for fuels control. I didn't even really know about regenerative grazing back then. And so it was like 2015, I got my first goat and built a small herd, and this was like messing around with some stuff on my property and the neighbor's property, helping out some other older folks. And I was on the Modoc Fire Save Council. Thought someday when I retire, I'm just gonna get me one of them RV trailers and just go to little old ladies' houses and help them with their fuels problem, try to keep them from burning down. But then when the tribe came around, I thought, well, here's an opportunity to put that resource to use for the tribe. And so we've been building that herd. We're right up to about 40 head right now, and we'll be up over 50 by the end of the spring here. And that's where we're kind of shooting for, to have that enough impact to do the short duration, high intensity treatments that we need. And so it's kind of more from more of a fuels related mindset to a more soil health, weed control, still fuels too, but kind of this more holistic regenerative approach. So shout out to Gabe Brown and Understanding Ag, and we'll be bringing them in this fall. If anybody wants to join us, get a hold of me.
Okay. So the goats eat the weeds and the stuff, and it takes care of some of the fuels, reduces the fuels that could lead to wildfire. Is that how this is working?
Yeah. I think goats approximate the native herbivores a lot better than some of the other ungulates like cows. And, cows select for their preferred food. They'll eat the rest of the stuff, but they'll eat all the other stuff first. And they leaves a lot of stuff alone that the goats will go. It's a really good rotational practice to put goats on cattle pasture. You can bring back a lot of productivity in the cattle pasture with just a few years of goat grazing on there, because they actually will select those weeds over some of the grasses. But they also browse on brush. They'll eat the limbs. Come to my house and look, there is not a juniper tree within a half mile of my house that isn't browse up to about head height. And if you think about a flame length on cheatgrass, it seems to me like another evidence for creation that a goat on its hind legs is just getting that fuel out of the reach of a flame length of a cheatgrass. It's like the perfect height for that.
That's all right. Well, thank you for sharing about the goats. Thank you for your time
Yes, ma'am.
today. I appreciate you coming in.